All right, chapter 12 is managing conflict in the 13th edition of the textbook. And there are 5 sections in this chapter. And the first one where we're going to begin is simply by definition. And here we define conflict. The definition that is given is by Hawker and Wilmot. And the definition is broken down in detail in the chapter. Some of the most important words in this definition are interdependence and perceive. The conflict does not have to be real. It is simply the perception of the issues that might trigger the conflict. And again, you can go to the textbook for more details. The next section we want to explore are different styles of conflict. And oftentimes individuals have sort of default patterns of resolving conflict, communication behavioral patterns they fall into. And there are 5 styles altogether. The first is avoidance. And this used to be called a lose-lose. These are your conflict avoiders. They typically don't like conflict, so they don't engage. And they rather not speak up at all. Accommodation is when you have one person who just allows the other person to have their way, simply maybe because it's not important to you or the relationship is more important. I like the way your textbook brings in the discussion of culture in this. I think that's important. A win-lose is a competition. So here you might have a higher concern for the things that are important to you, and can be very influential in the development of a relationship. Then we have passive aggression. A passive aggression, this is a communication style that tends to be a little bit indirect. You are expressing dissatisfaction in a disguised manner. It can be guilt trips, it can be sarcasm, it can be all the huffing and puffing and big sighs around the house, which is certainly better than direct aggression. Direct aggression is you're no longer really dealing with the issue, you're focusing on the person. So there are character attacks, certainly physical violence, but a lot of verbal escalation, insults, malicious teasing, things like that. And they definitely can have a strong effect on your audience. Compromise is this idea of a negotiated win-lose, and both people sacrifice, both people get what they want, and it can be a satisfactory solution or resolution to a conflict, but it's certainly not the ideal. The ideal is what's called a collaboration or a win-win, which is when all parties to the conflict get what they want, and what you don't get doesn't really matter. It wasn't all that important to you anyways. So ultimately, when you take a look at the 5 communication styles, the question comes up, well, gosh, what's the best one to use? Well, there's no right way or wrong way. It all depends on your relationship with the other person. It depends on how important the situation is to you, and depends on what it is you want to get out of it. And so it's good to have all of those conflict styles in your behavioral repertoire, in your little suitcase of toolbox of communication behaviors, so that you can pull out the appropriate one at the right time. Okay, so now we're into section 3, which is conflict on relational systems. And here we talk about symmetrical and complementary relationship. But before we get to that, this slide talks about the conflict is relational because of the interaction amongst people. And if it weren't for that interaction, that engagement, conflict, of course, would never exist. So here are your 2 types of conflict, complementary and symmetrical. So it's important to understand that the extremes of either complementary or of symmetrical can be dysfunctional. Complementary is opposites. You have one dominant, one submissive. Symmetrical is the same. So you can have two dominants or you can have two submissives. I said extremes on either complementary or symmetrical are dysfunctional. What did I mean? Well, obviously, if you have extreme dominant submissive, we have the human trafficking technically is complementary relationships. Symmetrical, you have two very passive people who can't decide where they want to go eat for lunch. I mean, that's not functional. So this slide here, it sort of defines it a little bit more for you and gives you an idea of the meaning. Then we explore something called toxic conflict, and this is important. John Gottman has what he calls the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and he says these four variables, criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling, are huge predictors of relationships falling apart because they are so destructive to the relationship. They are so catastrophic in their impact in terms of the way that they undermine the foundation of relationships. So you'll get some more about this later on in the lecture. Conflict rituals are these very repeating patterns of behavior, and well, he's going to yell, she's going to burst into tears, and he's going to storm out of the house. And that's just this pattern. You just have this pattern. There are some conflict rituals that are very productive and healthy, and there are some, obviously, that are not. So now we're going to look at some of the variables in conflict styles, and here we're going to focus only on two key variables. The first is culture. Cultures differ in the way that they focus toward conflict and in the way that they express conflict. This discussion of preserving face has to do with maintaining social harmony. And many collectivistic cultures tend to be a little bit more on the face saving, and so they prefer a compromising, focused on the problem type approach. Gender is the other variable that's important to look at when you're understanding culture. Men tend to be a little bit more competitive. Women are more concerned with relational harmony. And what's interesting is your book makes the argument that the gender differences really are not that significant, but there's a tremendous amount of assumptions that there is. Conflict management and practice. This is how you put it all together. So it's important that you take a unique approach or very specific approach to the conflict at hand. And if you follow these steps, you can increase the likelihood of generating a win-win solution, a resolution that both parties are happy with. Now, it's very easy to look at these steps and think, oh, that just won't work in my life, and be cynical about it. But there's so much research that supports these 7 steps of conflict resolution that I strongly encourage you to sort of put aside your cynicism and your skepticism and really explore this section of the textbook in careful detail to sort of understand. There's a lot of research that supports that this will diminish conflict and increase the likelihood of having a more acceptable solution. So in a nutshell, that is everything in conflict in chapter 12. So that's it for now.